A little girl was playing in a millionaire's study, but what she handed him next. It wasn't just a drawing, it was the final missing piece of a broken life. Are you ready to feel something real? A little girl was playing in a millionaire's study, but what she handed him next. It wasn't just a drawing, it was the final missing piece of a broken life. Are you ready to feel something real? The golden rays of the Los Angeles sun faded slowly over the hills, casting a warm glow on the glassy windows of a grand estate where laughter had long ago disappeared, and in its place, silence screamed. Inside, a fragile little girl named Lila Grace, just 6 years old, crept barefoot across the cold marble floor, her golden curls brushing her tear-streaked cheeks as her tiny fingers reached toward the kitchen counter where a half-eaten plate of macaroni and cheese sat unattended. She moved slowly, carefully, as though even the sound of her breath might trigger another storm. Her stomach growled in quiet protest, a sound she had grown used to, just like the silence from the woman who used to be her whole world, her mother, who now looked at her as if she were just a forgotten memory. The kitchen lights flickered slightly, humming low as Lila took a cautious bite, her small hands trembling, not from fear of being caught stealing, but from the fear of being reminded once again that she no longer belonged. This wasn't about food, it was about survival, about scraping for a piece of warmth in a house where her presence felt like a crime. She chewed slowly, not daring to hope for more, when the front door burst open like a violent thunderclap, followed by the booming voice of Douglas Benton, her stepfather, whose heart had long since been buried under money and pride. His face twisted into rage the moment he saw her. The polished leather of his shoes echoed like gunshots across the floor as he stormed toward her. Lila's hands froze mid-air, macaroni still clutched between her fingers as she instinctively stepped back. "You dare touch my son's food?" he roared, his voice louder than the walls could contain. Before she could speak, before her lips could form even a whisper of an explanation, his hand came crashing down against her cheek, the sound sharp, unforgiving. Her bidye. Odie recoiled from the blow, but it was the sting in her heart that hurt most, the way his words cut deeper than any slap ever could. "You're nothing, you're not mine, your father's probably rotting in some ditch overseas, you should have died with him," he spat, towering over her like a monster in a nightmare. Her hand went to her cheek, not to ease the pain, but to make sure it was real. And it was. The burn reminded her that even in her innocence, she was considered a burden. He didn't stop there, he grabbed her small cloth bag, the one where she carefully kept her handmade arts, her only source of light in a world that had turned so dark, and hurled it out the front door as if it meant nothing. Her drawings, stick figures of her mother smiling, of a man she never met but always dreamed about, and of herself between them, scattered across the pavement like broken pieces of her soul. Her mother, standing just behind Douglas with her newborn son cradled in her arms, said nothing. She didn't flinch, she didn't step forward. She didn't even blink. The same woman who once whispered lullabies to Lila now stood as a stranger, frozen in her new reality, too afraid or too uncaring to stand up for the daughter who once called her hero. Lila's legs shook as she was shoved toward the door, the world outside colder than she remembered. Her bare feet touched the rough concrete as she stepped out into the evening chill, the door slamming behind her like the final chapter in a story she never asked to be part of. She looked back one last time, hoping someone, anyone, would open the door and call her name, tell her it was a mistake, that she was still loved, but all she heard was silence. No apology, no footsteps, just the lonely sound of a child being erased. Clutching her bag close, she gathered what drawings she could from the ground, her fingers trembling not just from the eye, but from the realization that she was truly alone. The slap mark on her face throbbed with each heartbeat, but she didn't cry out. Instead she walked, slowly, without direction, down the long driveway of the mansion that had never truly been her home. Streetlights flickered on one by one as she wandered past them, her shadow growing longer with each step, as if the night was swallowing her whole. Her eyes, once bright and full of curiosity, now held a quiet emptiness that only the broken-hearted understood. Cars passed, people moved around her, but no one noticed the little girl with art in her arms and pain in her eyes. She finally sat on a cold footpath beneath an old street lamp, her knees pulled to her chest, clutching the only pieces of her life that hadn't been taken. And in that stillness, in that breath between hopelessness and longing, she whispered a prayer, Not to be rescued, not for toys or warmth, but just for someone to see her, truly see her, and tell her she still mattered. The wind blew softly, lifting the corner of one of her drawings and brushing her cheek like a father's kiss she never received, a silent promise that somewhere, someone still cared. She closed her eyes for a moment, not because she wanted to sleep, but because she was tired of being awake in a world that had forgotten her existence. Yet fate had not forgotten, for just across the street, behind the glass of a towering skyscraper, a man would soon step outside and see her sitting there, not as a stranger, but as the heartbeat he had been unknowingly searching for. But for now, Lila remained there, still, small and lost, on the edge of a world that had thrown her away, unaware that the next moment would begin a story far bigger than the pain she now carried in silence. Just as the wind brushed softly against Lila's trembling face beneath the dim street lamp, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb across the road, and out stepped Ethan Cole, the charismatic yet quietly tormented 30-year-old CEO of Cole Innovations, his tailored navy blue C's out sharp against the night, his blue eyes reflecting both exhaustion and silent pain from battles no one ever saw. The late board meeting had drained his mind, but something in the air, something tender and aching, made his footsteps slow as he reached the sidewalk. He paused mid-step, instinct halting him as a soft, broken sob drifted through the hush of the city. His gaze lowered, drawn by a magnetic pull he couldn't explain, until he spotted her, curled up like a forgotten leaf, tiny arms wrapped protectively around rolled-up artwork, her face tear-streaked and hollow, the red marks on her cheeks screaming of cruelty that should never befall a child. His breath caught, chest tightening as if fate had reached out and grabbed him by the collar. He took a step closer, then knelt slowly, afraid any sudden move might scare her more. "Sweetheart." His voice was gentle, sincere, a whisper between strangers that felt strangely familiar. "What happened to you?" Her head turned slowly, and the moment their eyes met, something inside Ethan shifted. Her blue eyes mirrored his, not just in color, but in pain, in longing, in the kind of sadness no child should understand. Her voice came out cracked and quiet, like the last note of a broken violin. "He said I'm not his, he hit me, and he said my real daddy is dead." Each word stabbed into Ethan like ice, awakening an old sorrow buried deep beneath his polished exterior. He took off his blazer without a second thought, wrapping it around her shivering shoulders as if shielding her from every pain she'd ever known. "You're safe now, I promise," he said softly, but even he didn't realize how heavy that promise would become. Her small hands clung to his sleeve, trusting him already, not because she knew him, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, someone looked at her like she mattered. Ethan stood slowly and held out his hand. "Can you stand?" She nodded and rose cautiously, her movements slow, unsure if kindness was real. He led her gently to his car, holding the door open like she was royalty, not rubble. As she climbed in, her handmade drawings pressed tightly to her chest, Ethan's thoughts spiraled. Something about this girl felt hauntingly familiar, the way she looked, the stories she sketched, her very presence scratched at a memory he couldn't yet name. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city blurred into shadows behind them, but Lila's pain sat in the front seat like a third passenger, quietly sobbing through every silence. "Do you have a name?" he asked gently. "Lila," she replied. The name echoed in his chest like thunder, and though he didn't show it, he felt something crack inside him. "I'm Ethan," he replied, watching her as she rested her head against the window, her little fingers still clenching her crumpled art as if they were the only pieces of her she had left. "Are you hungry?" he asked, and she nodded shyly. Minutes later, they arrived at a small corner diner still open late. He guided her in with care, seating her in a booth by the window. The waitress eyed him curiously. Well-dressed CEOs didn't often walk in with tear-stained little girls at this hour, but he didn't care. He ordered grilled cheese and warm soup, watching her hands shake as she lifted the spoon. She winced slightly when the hot soup touched her cheek, brushing gently over the bruise. He noticed. "Did he hit you often?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet rage. She hesitated, then nodded, whispering, "Only when I touched his son's toys, or food, or breathed too loud." Ethan gritted his teeth but stayed calm. "And your mom?" Lila lowered her eyes. She used to be kind, but now she just watches. The silence after that was heavy, full of questions neither of them dared to speak aloud. But inside, Ethan was already unraveling. Something about her was too close, too painful. She looked at him again, her eyes glassy. "Are all daddies mean?" she asked. He felt a lump in his throat. "No," he said. "Some daddies never stop looking for their little girls." She blinked, unsure what that meant, but it sounded beautiful, like a story someone should have told her long ago. "Do you think my real daddy misses me?" she asked softly. Ethan stared at her for a moment too long. "I think he misses you more than anything in the world." The grilled cheese sat half-eaten as she leaned her head against the seat, eyelids heavy, soul tired. He paid the bill, scooped her gently into his arms, and whispered, "Let's get you somewhere safe." She didn't resist, she simply held on to him, her small arms wrapping around his neck, as if she'd been waiting for this embrace all her life. Back in his car, she slowly drifted into sleep, her breathing soft and even, while Ethan watched her face, a storm of emotions brewing in his heart. He didn't understand it fully yet, but something in him screamed that this wasn't coincidence. As he drove toward his penthouse, the moon followed them like a silent witness to a moment that would change everything. When they arrived, he carried her up to the guest room, tucking her into a plush bed lined with soft blue blankets. She murmured something in her sleep. "Daddy? Wait for me." And it shattered him. He stood at the doorway for a long time, unable to move, unable to breathe, his heart racing. This child was more than a girl in need, she was a mirror of something he'd lost. Ethan Cole, the man who conquered industries, suddenly found himself powerless against the quiet weight of a child's broken heart. And as the night settled in, he knew with a certainty he couldn't explain, this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of his. The moment Lila sat back down at the booth, her tiny fingers still wrapped protectively around the rolled paper she hadn't let go of since he found her, Ethan felt a strange anticipation tighten in his chest. And as though the truth itself was sitting just inches away, waiting to be seen. She nibbled cautiously on a fry, dipping it into ketchup as though each bite required permission, her eyes darting nervously around the room like someone trained to avoid attention. Ethan's gaze never left her, not out of suspicion, but because he was captivated by the fragile resilience radiating from her every movement. She chewed with quiet dignity, the flicker of innocence still shimmering beneath layers of sadness. "What's that you're holding?" Ethan asked gently, nodding to the bundle in her arms. She looked down at the rumpled roll and hugged it tighter. "My arts," she whispered, as though speaking too loud might break them. "I make them when my heart feels heavy." He gave a soft smile, trying not to show the growing ache inside him. "May I see them?" he asked. After a brief moment of hesitation, she slowly peeled back the paper, smoothing it out with her small hands. Ethan leaned in. The first image struck him like a punch to the soul, a woman's face drawn with childlike lines, but filled with so much love that the imperfections made it more real. Her hair curled in a familiar way, her eyes bright even in crayon, and that smile, he'd memorized it once. His breath hitched, his world tipping. "Who is she?" he asked, voice shaking. Lila glanced up. "She's my mommy," she replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I draw her every day so I don't forget how she looked when she loved me." That sentence carved into Ethan like a blade wrapped in sorrow. He couldn't look away. The woman in the picture was Emily. His Emily. The woman he loved. The woman who vanished 5 years ago with no goodbye, no note, no sign. His throat tightened as memories came flooding back, her laughter echoing in their old apartment, her fingertips brushing his cheek when she told him she was pregnant, the way her eyes lit up when they talked about baby names. "Do you have more drawings?" he asked carefully, already fearing what else he might find. Lila nodded and unrolled other page, this one showing the same woman sitting in a rocking chair, cradling a baby wrapped in a blanket. The lines were softer, more careful, like she'd drawn it many times. "This was when I was born," she whispered. "Mommy told me stories about how I smiled right away." Ethan blinked rapidly, fighting to stay composed as the image opened old wounds and lit new questions. A third drawing emerged, a picture of the same woman standing between a tall man and a small girl. The man had black hair, a sharp suit, and piercing blue eyes. Ethan stared. It was unmistakable. "And who's this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila looked up, almost puzzled by the question. "That's the man Mommy loved before. The man who left. She told me he went away for work and then never came back. So she thought he died." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Ethan could feel the blood drain from his face. Every detail, every line, every feature. The man in the drawing was him, not a resemblance, not a coincidence. Him. His face, his past, his wife, his daughter, his entire life, lost in one chapter and suddenly rediscovered on a diner table drawn by the hand of the little girl sitting across from him. The air grew heavy, the noise of the diner faded to silence, and Ethan felt like he was drowning in memories he didn't know he was still holding on to. The last time he had spoken to Emily was the night before his overseas flight. They had kissed, cried, promised to keep in touch. But then came the blackout, the untraceable months of no calls, no internet, no signal. When he returned, their apartment was empty. The landlord said they had moved. No forwarding address, no messages, no trails. He had searched for months, years even, before finally giving up, broken and exhausted. But now, sitting across from this child whose every sentence cut through time like a chisel through stone. Nay, Ethan realized he had never really lost them. He had been misplaced from them, torn from them by fate, but never truly forgotten. "Lila," he said gently, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Did your mommy ever show you pictures of your real daddy?" She shook her head. "No, just stories. She said he was brave and kind and had blue eyes like mine. She cried whenever she talked about him." Ethan reached for his wallet with trembling fingers, pulled out an old photograph of himself and Emily, back when the world was simple and full of dreams, and slid it slowly across the table. Lila studied it closely, her eyes lighting up like fireworks behind a veil of disbelief. She gasped, "That's her! That's Mommy!" Her finger hovered over the man. "And that's you." Her eyes snapped to his face, searching for answers her heart already knew. Ethan leaned forward, voice shaking with truth. "I didn't die, Lila. I came back and you were gone. I searched, but I couldn't find either of you." She blinked, stunned. "You're my daddy?" Ethan nodded, his eyes welling. "I am, and I never stopped loving you." In that moment the world shifted, not just for Ethan but for Lila, whose life had been built on half-truths, silence, and longing. She leaned across the table, crawling into his lap, her arms circling his neck with the kind of trust that no paper trail or DNA test could ever replicate. And as she buried her face in his chest, whispering, "Daddy?" over and over like a prayer finally answered, Ethan held her tight, feeling the emptiness inside him flood with purpose once more. Ethan stood frozen in the dim light of his penthouse study, the drawing still clutched in his trembling hands, while the city lights flickered beyond the glass walls behind him like fading memories trying to resurface. Yet none burned brighter than the face in that child's sketch, a face he once kissed each morning and whispered dreams to each night. He moved like a ghost, pulling open drawers he hadn't touched in years, reaching for the photo album he had buried beneath contracts, board presentations, and a life that had tried so hard to forget, but never quite succeeded. Dust swirled as he flipped open the worn leather cover, and there they were, he and Emily, standing on a rocky beach, the wind in her hair, her eyes full of secrets and sunlight, and his arms wrapped around her like a man who believed time would never betray him. He flipped again. There she was with a faint baby bump, radiant and nervous, clutching a tiny pair of shoes to her chest. He remembered it now, how she had clutched his hand that night on the balcony and whispered, "You're going to be a father." They cried then, both terrified and thrilled, and promised to never be apart. But life had a cruel way of testing promises. His business trip turned into months. Phone signals dropped, letters went unanswered, and when he finally returned, it was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a home stripped of laughter and a man too stunned to breathe. He had searched, hired detectives, made quiet inquiries, but the world swallowed her whole, and his grief turned into guilt, then into walls he never let anyone break. Now, years later, in a city of millions, a little girl with golden hair, bruised cheeks and haunted eyes had fallen into his path, not by chance, he was starting to believe, but by fate. He paced back and forth, chest tightening, fists clenching and unclenching, trying to piece together the missing chapters. He glanced toward the guest room door. Lila slept soundly, hugging the sketchbook like a lifeline, unaware that the man only steps away from her might be her own flesh and blood. Ethan sat down heavily, breath shallow, and stared at his own reflection in the darkened window. Blue eyes. Hers were the same. Emily's cheekbones. His stubborn jaw. It all added up now like a puzzle that refused to be solved for years, finally giving in under the weight of truth. "Why didn't you wait?" he whispered to the silent room, voice cracking. "Why didn't you let me explain?" But deep down, he knew, Emily must have believed he abandoned her, and if she had a child to protect, she wouldn't have stayed where pain lingered. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn business card with the name of an old private investigator. His hands hesitated, then set it down. This wasn't something he wanted confirmed by strangers. He wanted to feel it, see it, in her. He needed answers not from files but from her heart. He moved quietly to the guest room door, cracked it open, and watched the soft rise and fall of Lila's chest. The moonlight kissed her curls, and something inside him nearly shattered. She was so small, so strong, so much like Emily. He wanted to rush to her, hold her, tell her everything, but how do you tell a child you might be her father, when her world had already been broken by too many men who promised warmth but gave her cold nights and empty plates? He stepped back, ran a hand through his hair, and sighed. Tomorrow, he would talk to her. Not as a stranger, not as a man offering soup and shelter, but as someone ready to open wounds for the sake of healing, as someone who might be the father she'd been unknowingly drawing all along. His heart thudded like thunder against his ribs, drowning out the city's hum, leaving only one truth echoing in his chest. The past hadn't just knocked on his door tonight, it had come home in the arms of a child who didn't yet know she'd already been found. Lila stared at him, her spoon frozen midway to her mouth, as if the weight of his words had paused time itself. Her eyes, so wide, so glassy, searched his face like it held the missing half of her soul, and in that fragile silence, Ethan felt the ground beneath his heart crumble as he realized just how much those innocent eyes had been waiting for someone to see her, believe her, claim her. She blinked, as if struggling to believe that someone who wasn't yelling, or pushing her aside, or walking away had just spoken the words she'd dreamed about in her darkest nights, words wrapped in love, not pain. "But, how do you know?" she asked, her voice trembling like a bird too used to cages. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and slowly placed the drawing she had made, the one of Emily and the man with black hair, between them on the table, his fingers lightly brushing the paper as he whispered, "Because that's me. I used to stand exactly like this beside your mommy." And Lila gasped, her tiny hands flying to her mouth as if something unspoken had just clicked inside her. "And these eyes," he added softly, gently cupping her chin so she could see his up close, "they're yours. Or maybe yours are mine." And for a long breath, the world seemed to still, until Lila slowly reached out, not saying a word, just pressing her palm to his cheek, like she was memorizing the shape of a memory that had been waiting to be born. "But, Mommy said he never came back. She said maybe he was gone forever," Lila murmured, more to herself than him, and Ethan's throat tightened with regret as he whispered, "I didn't leave by choice. I was sent on a job across the world, and everything went dark. My phone, the internet, even letters couldn't reach her. When I finally returned, she was gone, the house empty, every trace of her vanished like sand in a storm." And Lila leaned forward, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "She cried sometimes at night. I heard her say your name once. She thought you forgot us." And Ethan swallowed the ache in his chest, a fire of guilt burning behind his ribs as he reached for her small hand and squeezed it gently. "I never forgot. I just didn't know where to look." And a teardrop rolled down Lila's cheek, landing on her eggs unnoticed. "Does that mean I'm really yours?" she asked, as if hoping for someone to finally claim her as more than a burden, more than a problem, more than something tossed aside. And Ethan knelt beside her chair, looked her right in the eyes and said, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." And Lila threw her arms around him without warning, burying her face into his shoulder as the dam inside her broke, tears soaking his shirt while his arms wrapped around her like armor made of love. For a long time they stayed like that, two broken pieces finally finding their match, two stories tangled back into one, and when she finally pulled back, her eyes sparkled with something he hadn't seen before: hope. "I used to dream about you," she whispered. "I'd imagine you'd come in a big car and take me away from that house, and you'd say I was your princess." And Ethan, barely holding his own emotions together, smiled through tears. "Then let's make that dream come true, starting today." And she grinned for the first time, the kind of grin only a child who's finally felt safe can give. But even as the joy floated between them, a flicker of worry crossed her face, and she asked softly, "But what about Mommy? And the baby?" And Ethan's smile faded slightly, the weight of those words grounding him again as he said, "We'll figure it out, together." And she nodded slowly, trusting him without question, as if her heart had already decided he was home. They sat back at the table, sharing a muffin, and as Lila giggled over a chocolate smudge on her nose, Ethan realized something profound. This wasn't just a reunion, it was redemption. Not just for her lost years, but for his own guilt, for the time he thought he'd never get back. And as the sun streamed through the diner window, casting a soft glow around them like a silent blessing, he made a silent vow in his heart: to protect her, to fight for her, to never let her feel abandoned again. And in that sacred moment, as the waitress refilled their orange juice and the world outside bustled on unaware, a father and daughter, finally found, sat at a table of second chances, piecing together a future neither of them thought they'd ever live to see. Lila's tiny lips parted, but no word. Diaz came out, her eyes shimmering with disbelief as her heart tried to catch up with her mind, searching for truth in the warmth of Ethan's trembling voice. Her breath hitched as he knelt before her, a towering figure of strength brought to his knees by the weight of lost years and unspeakable regrets, and she whispered in a voice so soft it barely carried through the room, "But how could it be you?" And Ethan, steadying himself, gently cupped her cheeks as if afraid she might vanish into another cruel twist of fate, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. "Your mommy told me about you just before I left. I was overseas, working, thinking I was building our future, but I lost contact. No calls, no messages, no way to find her again. When I came home, everything was gone, like a part of me was stolen." And his words trembled as they spilled from lips too long sealed with sorrow, his hands shaking with the ghost of every birthday missed, every tear she cried that he never wiped, every hug he wasn't there to give, until Lila's tears burst free, running down her cheeks like rivers of release, and in that quiet moment she threw herself into his arms, burying her face against his chest and sobbed, "Daddy," like a truth she'd been waiting her whole life to say, and Ethan clutched her so tightly, as if the world might steal her again if he let go, whispering through his tears, "I'm here now, sweetheart. I've missed every second of your life, and I'll spend the rest of mine making it right." And in that fragile embrace, time stood still, two hearts broken by fate now mending in each other's arms, while outside the city buzzed on unaware that within the walls of a penthouse, a father found his daughter, and a little girl found her home, not made of bricks, but of love and the sound of a heartbeat she never knew she knew. And Ethan, eyes wet and voice resolute, stood up with purpose, holding her hand like a vow, and without a moment's delay he grabbed his phone and dialed his top attorney, his voice firm despite the emotion in his throat. "Prepare the custody papers immediately. I've found my daughter, and I won't let her spend another night wondering if she's loved." And as Lila looked up at him with eyes that mirrored his own, those same blue oceans that once looked into Emily's eyes, he smiled through the ache in his soul, brushing her hair back as if to etch every feature of hers into memory, and she smiled back, the kind of smile that blooms only when hope returns from exile, when a child feels safe, truly safe, for the first time. And he promised again, more to himself than to her, "You'll never cry alone again, Lila, not on my watch." And she giggled softly, the giggle of a child relearning joy, and as he held her hand tighter, Ethan felt his world realign. His business, his empire, his riches, all seemed empty next to this moment, this tiny hand in his, this daughter he was ready to fight for with everything he had. And Lila, wiping her eyes, asked so innocently, "Does that mean I can call you Daddy now?" And Ethan, his voice cracking, nodded slowly, "You always could." And in that moment, the past's cruel weight began to lift, piece by piece, because love had returned, not as a memory but as a living, breathing little girl who held his heart in her hands. And as he scooped her up in his arms like she was the only thing that mattered in the world, a quiet but powerful storm brewed inside him, not of anger but of justice, of reckoning, for those who let her suffer, and a sacred fire lit behind his eyes, knowing that from this day forward, Lila would never again sleep cold, go hungry, or be unloved, because the father she'd dreamed of, the man she'd drawn 1,000 times with hope and crayons, was finally here. Real, present, and never leaving again. Ethan didn't wait another second. After hanging up the call to his legal team, he held Lila's hand and looked into her teary eyes with a fierce, unwavering promise burning inside him. No more nightmares, no more fear, no more monsters under her bed, because the real one was walking free, and that was about to change. His driver pulled up the Bentley within minutes, and Ethan, usually calm and composed, was silent with determination, his mind racing with memories of Lila's trembling voice, her bruises, and those quiet cries she must have muffled night after night. Lila sat beside him, both nervous and brave, clutching a small teddy bear Ethan had bought her the night before, as if she knew this journey would close the darkest chapter of her life. The gates of Douglas Benton's mansion loomed large like the walls of a dungeon, cold and proud, unaware of the storm about to knock them down. The security hesitated, recognizing Ethan from the tabloids, but one look at his face, and they stepped aside. The door opened, and there he was, Douglas Benton, smug, leaning in the doorway like he still owned control over the world. But when his eyes locked on Ethan, his smirk faltered, and when he saw Lila hiding behind him, his posture stiffened. "Well, well," he muttered, arms crossed. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with iron. "You remember her?" he asked, nodding at Lila. "The little girl you called useless, the one you starved, the one you raised your hand to? She's my daughter, and I'm here to end this." Douglas tried to laugh it off. "You've got no proof." Ethan pulled out a small remote and clicked. On the screen of his tablet played crystal-clear footage. Douglas yelling, a slap, Lila's shriek, her crawling into the kitchen for a piece of bread. The images tore through the silence like knives, and even Douglas, shameless as he was, took a step back. "This footage was pulled from a hidden camera your housekeeper installed when she feared for Lila's safety," Ethan said coldly. "My team recovered it, and my lawyers have already filed charges." Panic flickered across Douglas's face. "You don't scare me. You think money can take her from her mother?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "Her mother already gave up on her. She watched you do this and said nothing, but I won't, and neither will the court." Just then, 2 police cars pulled into the driveway, lights flashing, engines low and menacing. Officers stepped out with paperwork and handcuffs ready, and Douglas turned pale. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking as they approached. "She's lying. That brat's been manipulating you." But Lila stepped forward, shaking but brave. "You locked me outside in the rain, you called me trash, you told Mommy I didn't matter." Her small voice silenced the air. One officer nodded at her, gently guiding her back to Ethan. "That's enough," the other said, twisting Douglas's arms behind his back. He shouted, flailed, cursed, but it was over. The monster had fallen. As they dragged him out, Ethan stood tall with Lila beside him, a hand on her shoulder. The sky was gray, but to Lila, it felt like sunlight had finally reached her heart again. Neighbors peeked from windows, some whispering in shock, others silently relieved that the truth had found its way through the darkness. Ethan turned to Lila, crouching down to her level. "He'll never hurt you again, not ever." Her lips quivered. "Promise?" He smiled softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "With everything I am." They drove away from that house, not a home, never a home, with Lila staring out the window one last time before turning her gaze forward, where a new life waited. At Ethan's penthouse, the city felt warmer somehow, safer, as if it too had heard her story and wrapped itself around her like a blanket. She held Ethan's hand tighter at the elevator, not letting go even when they reached the top floor. The nightmare was over, but her healing had only just begun, and Ethan was ready to walk every step with her. As Douglas was taken away in handcuffs, his shouts echoing through the cold marble halls of his mansion, Ethan turned to Lila and gently squeezed her hand, whispering, "It's over, sweetheart, he'll never hurt you again." But justice, though served, was only part of the healing. The next storm was already waiting in the courtroom downtown. Days later, the courthouse loomed large, casting long shadows over broken memories and painful truths. Emily, dressed plainly and clutching the court summons like it was a confession letter, walked through its doors with trembling steps. Her eyes darted around nervously, her lips dry with fear and regret, shoulders slumped under the weight of years lost to lies. She hadn't seen Ethan in nearly a decade, hadn't held her daughter since that terrible night Douglas forced her to choose silence over safety. She'd been told Ethan vanished overseas, abandoned them both, and every call, every letter, every desperate attempt to reach him was intercepted by the man who claimed to protect her. But now, walking into the courtroom, she saw a man standing tall, with the same blue eyes she once fell in love with, and beside him, a child she could never forget, with those same eyes filled with questions and pain. Her heart clenched as her knees weakened. The world slowed. "Ethan?" she breathed, her voice cracking as tears filled her eyes. Lila turned, uncertain, then froze. Her mother stood like a statue shattered by time, remorse flowing freely down her cheeks. "I thought you were gone. I thought you left me," Emily whispered, almost collapsing as her voice broke. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He studied her face, aged not by time but by torment, and finally said, with quiet strength, "I never left. I searched. For years. I was lied to, too." Emily sobbed, covering her face, as the truth shattered every lie Douglas ever built. The judge, observing silently, gave them a moment before starting proceedings. Lila clung to Ethan's arm but looked at her mother with a glimmer of hope and hurt tangled together. "Mommy?" she whispered. Emily stepped forward, hands shaking, and dropped to her knees. "I'm so sorry, baby. I never meant to let this happen. I was scared. I was trapped. I should have fought harder." Her apology was not just words. It poured from her soul, cracked open by guilt and longing. Ethan knelt beside Lila, gently guiding her forward. "She's been through so much," he said softly, not out of anger but truth. "We all have." The courtroom, heavy with silence, was filled with raw emotion. The judge finally spoke, her voice calm yet firm. "Emily, your past choices endangered your child, but your willingness to seek truth, admit fault, and accept help speaks volumes." A therapist stood to testify that Emily had already begun trauma recovery sessions, desperate to rebuild herself. After reviewing evidence, the judge gave her a chance, not custody, but hope. "Supervised visits only," the judge ruled. "If you show progress, healing is possible." Emily nodded through tears. Anything to just see her smile again. Lila didn't run into her mother's arms, not yet, but she took one small step forward, then another, and allowed Emily to gently hold her tiny fingers for just a moment, fragile, but not broken. Ethan watched quietly, tears in his own eyes, realizing this wasn't the ending he expected. It was a beginning carved from pain but blooming with second chances. Outside the courtroom, as they stood beneath the bright summer sky, Emily approached Ethan once more, humbled. "Thank you. For finding her, for saving her, for not giving up on either of us." Ethan nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I didn't do this alone, Lila. She's the one who saved me." The little girl looked up at them, the wind catching her curls, her heart still healing but open. For the first time in years, her family stood on the same ground, imperfect, shaken, but real. The shadows of manipulation were lifting, and in their place, a fragile but growing light began to shine. The courtroom lights dimmed in memory, but what came after felt like light pouring in after years of darkness, and as Ethan gently guided Lila out of the courthouse that day, the weight of justice finally settled into peace. He didn't speak. He simply held her hand like it was the only truth he'd ever need, and as they drove down the winding coastal highway, the sea breeze lifting Lila's golden strands of hair, he turned to her and said, "How do you feel about living near the ocean?" To which she answered with wide, gleaming eyes, "Can I paint the waves every day?" And that was all he needed to hear. Within a week, Ethan purchased a cozy cream and blue cottage nestled a short walk from the shore, its windows always open to the sound of gulls and surf, and when Lila stepped into the room that would be hers, her small gasp made him close his eyes. The walls were blank, waiting for her to fill them with color, freedom, and dreams, and she did just that, painting suns with sleepy eyes and dolphins that smiled back at her, each brushstroke a piece of her healing. Every morning, Ethan would find her already awake, sitting by the window with her sketchpad on her lap and toes curled on the wooden sill, watching the waves roll in like they were whispering lullabies just for her, and he made her pancakes every Saturday. Blueberry smiley faces became a tradition, the kind of silly thing only real fathers and daughters share. They laughed loudly during breakfast, sometimes tossing flour at each other until the kitchen looked like a snowstorm had hit it, and afterward, they'd take walks barefoot on the sand, Lila collecting smooth stones shaped like hearts while Ethan collected every moment like a fragile treasure. School was no longer a battlefield but a playground of possibility, and though she was shy at first, she found comfort in Ms. Green, her art teacher, who noticed her talent immediately and asked to hang one of her paintings in the hall. A gesture that made Lila blink rapidly and whisper, "I've never been proud of anything before." Ethan drove her to school every morning, kissed her forehead before she ran off, and waited by the gate every afternoon, often arriving early just to see her run toward him with arms flung wide and eyes shining. At night, he read her stories of brave girls with magical paintbrushes, and she'd drift to sleep clutching his hand, whispering, "You're my hero," while he blinked away the ache of lost time. Her nightmares slowly faded, replaced by dreams where dolphins danced and the moon smiled down on her. Ethan started to sleep better too, the silence of his old penthouse replaced by the rhythm of waves and her soft breathing from the next room. One evening, as a storm rolled in, she crawled into his bed, curled up under his arm, and said, "This house feels like a hug," and he held her tighter, whispering, "That's because it is." On weekends, they visited the local farmer's market, and Lila would convince him to buy more fruit than they could eat just so she could paint them later, turning peaches and cherries into still-life masterpieces. They built sandcastles with moats deep enough to drown the past, and one time, when a wave crashed over her tower and she looked ready to cry, Ethan helped her build it back stronger, saying, "It's okay if things break. We always rebuild." The neighbors grew to adore them. Mrs. Carter next door would bring over cookies and invite Lila to garden, and Lila planted her very own sunflower that bloomed taller than her by summer's end. Ethan hung her artwork all over the house, replacing corporate certificates with rainbow skies and seahorses, and every time he passed her painting of the two of them holding hands beneath a sunset, he paused and kissed it gently. Sometimes, she'd ask about her mother, and he answered every question with care, not bitterness, because he wanted her memories to carry healing, not hate. They began journaling together, one page a night, hers full of doodles and stickers, his filled with words like, "Today you smiled without flinching, and I knew we were winning." On her birthday, he surprised her with a wall-sized canvas, and together they painted their family story, her choosing pinks and golds and writing, "Found," in big letters at the top. And on quiet nights, when stars winked at them through the skylight, Lila would lean against him and say, "This is our forever now." And Ethan knew no boardroom, no wealth, no empire had ever meant as much as this. This girl with ocean eyes who taught him that love isn't measured in time, but in effort, in forgiveness, and in choosing each other again and again. One night he tucked her in, brushed a lock of hair behind her ear, and whispered, "I lost you once. Never again." And she, half asleep, murmured, "Good night, Daddy," her voice like a lullaby stitched with peace. And as he sat beside her, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, his eyes shimmered, not with regret, but with gratitude, for the second chance he'd never take for granted. The soft rustling of paper echoed through the quiet study as sunlight danced through the open window, casting golden stripes across the hardwood floor. Lila, now full of life and laughter, had wandered in while Ethan reviewed contracts, her small hands curiously digging through drawers filled with forgotten memories. She gasped softly, her fingers brushing against the edges of an old drawing, the same one she once clutched with trembling hands when her world was still shattered. She held it up proudly. "Daddy, look what I found again." Ethan turned, his tired eyes lighting up with warmth as he saw her holding the image of a woman smiling beside a man in a suit, their hands joined. "That's Mommy and that's me, right?" he asked, voice cracking ever so slightly, the weight of years folding gently into the moment. Lila giggled and pointed. "Yes, but you're not wary. Nangatai in this one, I thought you looked happier that way." He chuckled softly, touched beyond words, marveling at the innocence in her voice that somehow carried the wisdom of survival. Then, with a twinkle in her eye, she pulled out a second folded sheet from behind her back like it was a secret treasure, handing it to him with reverence. Ethan unfolded it slowly, his breath catching as he took in the crayon masterpiece. There she was, a little girl with blue eyes holding hands with a smiling man in a shiny blue suit, the sun beaming above them, and in her other arm, a large red heart wrapped in bold, careful letters that read, "Home." The word wasn't just drawn, it was felt, etched into every line, every curve, soaked in all the pain, healing, and love that had brought them here. His arms wrapped around her instantly, pulling her close, his voice shaking as he whispered, "You are my greatest masterpiece, sweetheart." Lila nestled into his chest, the beat of his heart more comforting than any lullaby she'd ever known, her tiny hands gripping the edge of his shirt as if afraid the moment might vanish. He kissed her head, silently thanking the universe for guiding her back to him, for rewriting a broken story into something beautiful. The framed photo of her first day back at school hung on the wall beside them, and beside it, a new family photo, Emily, now smiling weakly but steadily during a supervised visit, slowly rebuilding her identity, her dignity, her motherhood. Lila's laughter rang out again as she picked up a pen and added a little puppy to her drawing. "So we can get one next, right?" she teased, and Ethan grinned, pretending to weigh the responsibility, even though he'd already called the shelter. Outside, the sound of waves crashing against the shore echoed through the open patio, reminding them both that peace had finally arrived, not just in the house, but in their hearts. Ethan set the drawing gently on his desk, beside legal documents now signed and sealed that named him her full guardian. There would be no more courts, no more threats, just voiture. Weekends at the beach, art shows at school, and bedtime stories whispered under glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. As she skipped out of the room to prepare her art gallery, the camera slowly zoomed out, framing the space where a once lonely man now stood not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as a father, whole, present, fulfilled. Ethan looked after her, eyes soft, and whispered, "She saved me more than I ever saved her." Then, gently, Lila's voice took over, layered with emotion and innocence, narrating over the fading scene as the camera panned toward her colorful drawing pinned proudly to the wall. "Sometimes, the people who save you are the ones who've been searching for you all along." The screen faded to black, leaving behind the sound of waves, laughter, and the quiet, powerful heartbeat of a love finally found and never again lost.